Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm very excited tonight because we have a lot of cool stuff to go over, and I think I am more prepared and organized than ever before. I'm starting to get the hang of this. So I'm very excited to show you guys what we've got, talk about the cool things that we've got going on. I think that we're going to have a lot of fun, especially with all the things we're going to be looking at. So, as I mentioned, the things that we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be talking about the consulting designer feedback we got from their first quest, the quest or their assignments, as we call them. We're going to be talking about our weekly design journal from last week. We're going to be talking about our new weekly design journal challenge, a couple of just general design topics that I've been exploring and playing with, and some of the things that we are now leaning towards so you guys can get a look at what it is that we're putting together. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, wait till you see this. This is very, very fancy. Look at that. Yep, I've got a actual graphic for you guys to sort of show the things that we're going to be talking about and make it a little easier to follow our conversation as we go through things. So, although some of you who have way too many PowerPoints at work might look at this and be horrified by it and have some PTSD, and for that, I do apologize up front. But let me go ahead and jump into things, and we're going to start taking a look at what we have been working on. So first up, I want to talk a little bit about our consulting design journal, our designer feedback. Now, the two things that they were asked to look at, if you remember, was first to give us feedback on the Tome of Requirements, the revised Tome of Requirements. Remember, that's the tome that we redid based on all of your feedback. And then the second thing is to get some general feedback, thoughts, ideas from them on getting started on this. Now, I got some incredible stuff. I can't possibly go through all of it, but I am going to give a few highlights here so you guys can sort of get a look at what it is and maybe learn from it the same way we have, right? Oh, and of course, as always, feel free to jump in with questions or comments or anything else that you might have along the way. Absolutely want to get all of your thoughts and answer any specific questions you have, even if it's unrelated to what we're doing. So, Tome of Requirements. What did our consulting designers have to say about this? Well, first off, they generally across the board mentioned, yeah, this is awesome to have. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is not just to like pat myself on the back or something like that. The reason I'm bringing it up is they said that a lot of games, when people go to create their own game or create their own system, or just dig into a project like this, they don't think about this up front. They don't have this document, and they think that it hurts a lot of folks that are trying to create something of this magnitude and of this complexity. You've got to think about what your goals are. Now, what I'm doing is applying what I do on a day-to-day basis with software development and management. But the reality is that this sort of a project, it doesn't matter whether it's a role-playing game, it doesn't matter whether it's a setting book, having this book of requirements is super, super important. And they were really pleased to see it. They said that it already puts us on the right track to end up with a really good game. So very happy to hear that. Many of the goals were very solid, across the board. They were very happy with a lot of the stuff that we had in there, talking about things like how we wanted the game to play, what sort of things were important to us within the gameplay. And I don't need to go in all the specifics of what were solid, but what I will go into is that they did say that some of the goals are going to be very difficult to implement. Now, this is the one that sort of interests me, because one of the first things that they hit on is one of the things that I know all of us, a lot of the conversations folks have really, really wanted, which is that every aspect of the game is as fun and engaging and as well defined within the game rules as combat. So that's pretty great, but apparently it's really, really hard to do. And it's something that lots of people have tried to do over the years, and some not very successfully, some actually tanked their entire effort. So it's an area that we're going to have to be really, really careful about as we move forward, thinking about that and not getting too hung up on whether or not it's as robust as the combat system or things like that. And we may have to look at it along the way too and sort of make decisions about how much time we want to spend on it. So apparently it's a really tough thing to pull off. There was also disagreement on some of the goals. Some of the things that, let me pull up really quick. I just look at my other notes here that I was making. There was some disagreement on ideas like, for example, fun. I don't think I have that one in here, but one of the things that came up was whether fun should be listed in the list. Well, I personally think it needs to be there from the point of view that, and when I talked to Steve Long about this, he understood what I was trying to do with that. I always want us to keep that in mind. It's easy to get carried away on a project like this where you start thinking about all the different cool things you're doing and it's all very clever, but you lose sight of the underlying idea that it's supposed to be fun, right? It's supposed to be fun. And by voicing that up front, it's a good reminder to constantly come back to it. So I may keep that one there, but that was an area with some disagreement. Another area of possible disagreement was about some of the things that we talked about in terms of keeping people engaged in the game. Things like running out of resources and still being able to stay engaged and involved. Things like if your character is dead and being able to engage as a player. If your character really doesn't fit the scene and being able to engage as the player. There was concern that this is going to be a bit of a leap for a lot of players, and it might be a stumbling block for people who are trying to understand the game, and it might throw them out of the experience. Whereas not being involved because your character is not there keeps it more real. So I'm going to want to go back to that one, and I'm going to want us to think about it and make sure that it's the right thing to do. And I thought it was some very interesting points about that. Another piece was you risk with the whole idea of like, if you run out of resources, you're not left out of the action. You risk people not being thoughtful about that, where they're just wasteful and they know that they're still going to be able to play anyway. So what are they worried about, right? Is that something that we'd actually see? I don't know. It's something we're going to have to think about. And you guys, I'm interested what all of you are thinking about that too, but I think that's going to be a tricky one. All right, so let's see, what else have we got here? Next up, additional clarity. And this goes back to that one about fun. He said, if you're going to have it in there, you need to clarify what fun is a little more than what we did. And we did a decent job of it, but it sounds like we could have done a better job there. Oh gosh, looks like YouTube was saving up all the comments and they poured in all at once. Let's see. One of the things that came up, Master of the Game was saying that, yeah, sometimes things you may think something is fun, but can it be more fun if you handled it differently? Yep, absolutely. One of the other things that came up was he also mentioned a blaze of glory mechanic, where if your character's delivering a final blow, that maybe they can do one last thing in a blaze of glory. I've always kind of enjoyed that because look, if you're going to go down, at least you go down being awesome, not in one of those things where you critically fail and accidentally stumble and get stabbed by the bad guy's spear. And then that's the end of your story, which is an awfully sad way to end a heroic story. So yeah, absolutely. There's stuff that we can do there. All right, let's see what else. Risks. There are some things that are risky, right? Some of the things like going back to those goals, those difficult goals, we do risk situations where we might make it hard for people to get into it. If we stray too far from the known territory of standard gaming tropes in terms of rules, we do risk people not being able to grok the game. And as a result, it blocks them from playing it. There are things that we need to be a little bit cautious about as we move forward here in terms of possible risks. And so they helped us outline some of those. And then this is the big one. It's too long. It's way too long. We got to narrow it down. I agree that all the stuff in there really matters, but at some point it is true that if there's too much there, you end up with conflicting potential goals. You end up with not being sure which one is the highest value. So there was a lot of talk about how this is a great tool. We should have it in place in terms of our guiding principles, but now we need a more refined design document. That's not going to stop us from getting started and working on stuff, but we absolutely want to try to refine a clearer design document for going forward. And we're going to talk about some of that. I've got some good stuff there. There was I like to bring in some of the comments here as well that you folks are adding. So here we go. Richard Lee Byers said he doesn't think there's anything wrong with a particular PC being the one to shine at a particular moment, as long as every PC gets a share of those moments. And that's true, right? You want to make sure that each person is able to shine, even if that doesn't mean that they're the one standing in front with the sword and the shield and glowing in front of everyone. But they've got to know, as a group, you guys behind the scenes need to know that they are shining, even if their goal isn't shining before the NPCs, right? And I think that that's a super important thing. Absolutely. All right, so let's take a look at what's next here. Next up, I'm going to talk about the core design goal. Now, this is something that Robin Laws put together, and I've put together basically what he said, and it is a rich statement that I absolutely love. And I'm just going to read through this for those of you. We may end up pushing these out as podcasts as well, so I'm going to read through this. In Cool Name RPG, you are adventurers in a fantasy world who fight adversaries and explore dangerous places in pursuit of fortune and advancement. Basic, referring to the basic rules, has a short learning curve, is self-contained, and has a low handling cost, and therefore plays fast at the table. Advanced, referring to the advanced system, rewards system mastery and thus tolerates a longer learning curve, a higher handling cost, and a slower pace in order to achieve focused, detail-oriented play. This is beautiful. This is exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish, and this is a really good way of saying it. We're probably going to use some version of this in that design document that we're using. That's going to be like a one-pager to just like build it out. When I say design document, don't worry, I'm not spending time writing another 20-page document or anything. The focus here is just simply to put this down and focus in on this. And I think that this is a great way of putting it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the basic and advanced naming in just a minute. But this core design goal really does a good job of focusing on what we want to do and what the role of the two different games are, two different versions of the game are. So I actually don't have much more to say. It's like beautifully stated. So we're going to look at the next thing, which is sort of related, which is a key observation that Robin made as well. Look, everybody gave us amazing feedback. Steve and Andrew and Robin and everybody gave us great feedback. There are just a couple of things I want to share from Robin's that were just like, yes, that's it. And here it is. I posted this elsewhere. You may have already seen it, is that your respondents are people who want to interact with each other at the gaming table, not with the rule book. They want to interact with each other at the gaming table, not with the rule book. This is a fantastic statement. And the reason why is that we, throughout our requirements, and the requirements that all of you seem to like the most when you went through the system, when you went through the survey, answering what you thought about those requirements, this is the underlying statement that you made to us. And that is fantastic. The truth is that we can do this. And we can do this really well, especially if we keep it in mind throughout the process. And there are some things that come up later where we talk about ways to do this, because this isn't just about the game design. It's also about the information design. How do we present the information? And one of the key things I want to point out here is that one of the first responses I got was someone who went, well, we don't want like a narrative only game, right? We want to have rules. Well, I think that's what's interesting about this. This isn't about the number of rules. It's about how much looking up those rules at the table interrupt the interactions between the players. Because that's the thing that's key, is that right now in today's world and in entertainment, we have video games that are amazing, absolutely amazing at allowing us to interact alone with a set of rules and with the world. We can do that today. In amazing ways with things like everything from Skyrim to what is the one everybody's playing these days? I'm losing my train of thought on it. But any of the games that are out there, Witcher 3, that, these are all older ones, but these are all games that are absolutely amazing. And by the way, if someone remembers the fantasy role-playing game that literally everyone on the planet but me is playing right now because I'm busy doing cool name stuff, put it in the comments so I can remember what it is. But the fact of the matter is that what makes it different is that we're interacting with one another at the table. And that's what makes role-playing what it is. And table might mean Zoom, right? But we're interacting with one another. And so I would love to see us keep this in mind at all times. And when we're trying to weigh two different options, asking ourselves, does this allow the players to interact with one another? or does it force them to interact with the rule book? And what can we do? Octopath is another one that folks that Zero the Blade mentioned. Thank you. It's not the one I'm thinking of, but another one. Brandon Sanderson apparently played through it multiple times and won. That helps anyone remember what the heck. Elden Ring. Thank you, Master of the Game. Elden Ring, which apparently I have to play because everyone on the planet says it's the greatest game ever. So, so that key observation I think is great. I'm going to go back for 1 second though. Let me just go back. I just got to find my tool. Going back to this core design goal, there was an interesting point that was brought up that I want to share. Whoops, that's an interesting point, but not the one I was looking for. All right. Master of the Game asks, interesting that advanced is a slower pace. What does this mean exactly? I think what this means is that, for example, if advanced allows you to make called shots, right? Advanced allows you to make some sort of more in-depth, robust character action and reaction. It's going to take a little bit longer at the table. If you have hit locations, for example, it's going to take a little longer at the table, but you're getting that detail-oriented play, and you're getting that cool effect and that reward of an awesome game system that you get for putting in that extra effort. Now, it doesn't mean it's not fun to play a faster, simpler game, but what it means is that you're getting rewarded for it, but it might take a little bit longer to do it. And so I think that's super important and very, very cool. Hopefully that answers your question on that. And by the way, I say it every week, check out Master of the Game's YouTube channel. Juice is amazing, does all sorts of cool stuff. So keep your eyes on that as well. All right, so I'm going to go on from here. Let's talk a little bit about basic and advanced naming. So one of the things that came up that again, Robin Laws pointed out was that we might want to rethink this, that there is a danger here. And I think it's a very valid danger, right? So one of the things is that suggested that the goal, when you say basic and advanced, the goal is to move up to the advanced version, right? Like the basic version is somehow simpler for people who aren't as capable, or who maybe this is where you start out, but you should move up to advanced. And that's not really what we're trying to say, right? It's not really what we're trying to say. What we really have are two modes of play. And that's been the idea all along. The idea that basic is a different way of playing. It doesn't require as much. It doesn't require you to use quite as many rules. It allows you to have a little bit faster, easier play. But the idea here is that you're not moving up to a higher level. And he suggested, we could have the naming we can play with. This is obviously one of our farther down the road things. But one of the things he could think about is like light or plus for the advanced or something like that. So I think that that's something that would be really interesting for us to explore. I'm going to take a short break from the information here to talk a little bit about some of the questions that are coming up here, because I want to be able to share these. So Master of the Game, do you anticipate that the advanced version of the game will have a lot of variety of optional rules? Yeah, I think that's exactly where that whole modular concept comes in, right? We talked about one of our goals being to be modular, where you can add in rule systems or add in rule choices that you want. That I absolutely think that's where advanced sits. And that's where you kind of get into tweaking it, right? It's sort of like tuning it, or, the difference between buying an off the rack computer and building your own, for those of you who build gaming computers, building your own rig, right? It's a very different sort of thing. And I think that that's more of like the experience. You get something for it, there's value in it, but there's going to be a little more effort that you're going to have to put into it. So yes, that's where I think you're going to see a lot of the rules, right? Let's see. Next up, we've got Richard Lee Byers says, if the sections of advanced are modular, independent add-ons, this may allow a group to decide how much slower they want the game to be. Absolutely, right? Like you're going to try something out and go, that's not for me. That we spend too much time on it. We don't want to mess with it. Another group might be like going, oh my God, we wouldn't play without that. To us, that's the coolest thing ever. I hope that we can create those opportunities. Now, we have to be careful. One of the risks, remember I mentioned there were risks? One of them is that you don't want to get into this whole something for everybody, right? This idea that you're going to make this perfect game that anyone can want to play. That's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm really talking about saying the game we make that people like to play have additional options. Think of it like DLC, right? Except that hopefully you won't have to pay a ton extra to add it, right? That's kind of where I'm thinking about it, right? All right. I have another comment here from Stephen Davis. All right. Stephen says, does self-contained mean for the players or also for the GM? I think the idea of self-contained here is that you wouldn't need a lot of extra content to play a basic game. You're not going to be picking up these expanded magic rules. You're not going to be adding in some expanded encumbrance system that somebody wants, or a trading system, or these sorts of things. It's going to be much simpler. And the book that you get, it's all right there. You're done. You're good. Now, could you change it or maybe add stuff from advanced? They're compatible. So absolutely, if you really wanted to, but you don't have to, right? You're going to get a great gaming experience just with that basic book in place. Right. Let me see. Joseph Keenan pointed out, and I think this is an interesting point as well. Um, a basic is more judgment calls from the GM instead of a ton of rules. That's exactly what's going to end up happening, right? You're going to have to ask yourself, and to be clear though, the rules still need to be solid. This is something that I talked to Steve Long extensively about the other day. You need to have a good rule set so the player understands what their chances are. So the player can make judgments about, do I want to do that? Do I not want to do it? If the rules are too squishy, they're never going to quite know whether they can do something. And it gets real nerve-wracking, and it takes a lot of the fun out of it as you're sitting there going, I don't really know what's going to happen when I do this. I can't make a guess. And so it is very important. The other thing is that when a person first starts playing a game, it's super important that they know how the game works, right? It sounds simple and obvious, but the truth is it really needs to be there. I think that that's super important. Let's see. And by the way, folks, make sure to like this and make sure to subscribe as well. That's going to help to bring more eyes onto this, because end of this week or early next week, we release the additional late pledging, which we keep talking about, but it's finally working. And that's going to let us get some art and stuff into the basic books that anyone can use, which will be very, very cool. So another comment I'm going to bring up here from Eric Brace. Eric says, light immediately came to mind for a simpler rule set. Complete or comprehensive came to mind for a more complex set. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be tough to find it, right? Because if we say complete, they'll be like, oh, so I'm not playing with the complete version? And you're like, well, okay, but comprehensive also could be very cool. I mean, we're going to have to work on it. There's going to be some look, core and expanded, Scott Gardner said. Good one. I like that one, right? That's very cool. That is very cool. And then light and mastery edition. That one could work too, right? The only thing I want to be careful about is, so I played with mastery edition and I saw it. Does it sound like that if you're not using that one, then you're just like a beginner, right? I don't want it to feel like that. I want people to feel like they can run masterful games with the basic set. So yeah, I thought the exact same one came to mind for me. So all right, so let's jump back over here and start looking again. Jump back to this, my presentation of sorts that I've got for you guys. So we talked about naming. And from here, I'm going to start talking about ideas, all the awesome, cool ideas that came along with the feedback I got from our consulting designers. One of the things that came up was we need to be careful about going too radical. The idea of an alternative to D20, meaning 5th edition, still rings in backers' minds. And I think this is a great point. A lot of people back this because they wanted an alternative to D20. They didn't want to copy, they didn't want to clone, but they wanted something they could try instead of 5th edition. Now, it didn't mean they didn't want to play 5th edition. It's a great game. They want to still play it, but they wanted something that they could play alongside it, an alternative, an equal alternative. And if we get too radical, we risk turning some people off. And I'm not saying we want to make everyone happy, but at the same time, we're not trying to make everyone go like, we don't want to say like, well, you'd like it if you understood it. It's very avant-garde, right? There's a place for that, but not in this project and not for the 577 or so people who backed it. There is a desire that we even if we try new ideas, that we don't go way too far off the beaten path. And I think that's a fair argument, right? Another thing that came up was the idea of, in terms of making this intuitive, was the idea of shooting for something with a linear progression and a granular die. And by linear progression is like, +2, +4, +8. It adds to your abilities or the target numbers or things like that. A pretty obvious progression of where the numbers go as you go along. Nothing too like, well, we'll get back to that. But, a numerical at times comes to mind for that. Doesn't necessarily have to be. Granular die values, though, is important. It's talking about the fact that when you're getting into like D6s and D8s, it gets a little bit harder to balance what the small changes in the game are, right? What the small differences are. And it gives you a little less wiggle room to be creative in terms of what you do, and a little less wiggle room in how you can grow. And so looking at like a D20 or percentile was the recommendation. Keep in mind that all of this is deserving of our brainstorm warning, right? These are just ideas. This isn't what we're going to do. It's just absolutely the brainstorm warning for everyone to keep in mind. Let me take a look here. One of these things that came up, Master of the Game pointed out, I was surprised that the feedback led the project to not worry as much about being compatible with D&D 5e, since it sort of rose from the OGL. I was too. That actually blew my mind that people were okay with that. I think that there's a difference between being okay with it and wanting us to completely break the mold. I think what folks were saying is that they didn't want us to use that as a requirement, that if we had to make a choice, we always lean towards 5e-ish, right? So I think that's what people were saying by that. Plus, keep in mind that 57 people answered the survey, so only about 10% of our backers actually answered that first survey. So I always try to keep that in mind as well, and go back to some of the comments and go back to some of the messages I've received along the way as well. It's a tricky balance, right? To make sure that I'm listening and also trying to keep in mind the voices I'm not hearing, which is, I guess, a little bit weird and might make me a little crazy at times, but it's a tough challenge and we have to do it. All right. Drink. Good. I'm good to go for the next round. Character sheets as a design tool. I thought this was really cool. Andrew Marlowe brought this up. The idea of using a character sheet as sort of your design tool, having iterations of a character sheet to sort of give you this idea of where you're going with bits and pieces of the work that you're doing, right? Focusing your attentions, looking at what it looks like and how the pieces interact with one another. It's a visual aid to help you imagine how to put this thing together, right? It's a very, very cool way to do it. Another idea, toss out attributes and focus just on skills. There's a reason I included this one, because if you are on our Discord, which is linked in the description here, if you're on our Discord, oh my God, there was so much discussion of this. There was a huge amount of discussion of this. Do you even need attributes anymore? Can we toss them out? Should we focus on other things? It's a great, great discussion about attributes and skills. But it's interesting that this also came up with our designers. Now I'm going to talk about attributes in a little bit, but this was just something interesting that came out of it. Another thing was, instead of having pre-gens, have nearly finished characters. For that colon doesn't belong there, but nearly finished characters. The idea being that they are in the basic set, for example, they're characters that you have a basic set of information available to you about the character, and then you make some choices. And the key thing here was that, and this was another issue that Robin brought up, was that by making even a few small choices, you suddenly are bound that much tighter to the character that you're playing, as opposed to a character that's completely finished that they put into your hand. I thought this was genius. I'm going to absolutely use it for my con games as well, for Ataltus, because I think it's a great idea. And so something just to keep in mind. And again, you probably remember that part of this is to help all of you learn for your next project. And so I want to share these sorts of ideas because I think they're very cool. Look at 4E and collectible card game design for information design. So the idea here is that looking at how those cards are set up, looking at how the information is put in. One of the ideas was, if it's more than 40 words, it's too much to describe an ability. That, remember, one of our things is we don't want people to have to look up everything at the table, right? We don't have to look up everything that we're doing. We want them to be able to just move on with the game and keep it going and interact with one another. He suggested that, and don't, for those of you who are not fans of 4E, don't start throwing things at your screen or flipping your computer table over. What I'm trying to say is that there's a lot to learn from the information design. The way they convey the information to the players is something that can be learned from. Same with collectible card games. There's a lot of value in paying attention to that. Let's see. Zero the Blade was asking, isn't character creation almost 50% of building how the game should be made? I think so, but the thing is that I could completely write a brand new way to create characters for any game system, right? There's so many approaches you can take to that, how you create the characters, but the system remains the same throughout. But I do think that if you're referring to the character sheet, I think the whole idea here is that it allows you to start to think and imagine how the pieces all interact with one another in a very visual sort of way. It's a great way of thinking about things. All right. Oh, there's another comment about, you don't think anyone wants a game where you need to have accessories to play successfully. I agree. I like games where you don't need the accessories, especially when it's an accessory that, like, there have been some games where there's like a compendium book and you're like, it's not required, but if you don't have it, you can't do half the stuff in the game that is kind of basic and cool. So I agree. It's very nice if you can have a game that is by itself completely playable and has all the core stuff you need. Let's see from here, other ideas. Oh, we are done with ideas and we are on to next steps. So what do we got to do next year? What do we got to build so we get this thing moving? Because right now I'm ready to start putting some rules down and having you guys take a look at them. And this is what we're moving to. One of the things we need to do is have that one-page design document, that single page that says this is what we're building at the end of the day. And that's going to include some things like base mechanics and such. Now, we're going to write it, and then we're going to build it, and then we're going to test it, and then we're going to say, oh my God, are we completely wrong? Right? And you're going to help us figure that out as we go along, right? Style of play. This has come up in a lot of places with a lot of people. What is the style of play of this game? And I'm going to tell you right now that although we're going to have a question on the upcoming survey that is delayed because I went through the consulting designer work first, the style of play is going to come up. What I think we're aiming at is effectively what we had in the Dungeons and Dragons movie. So if you haven't watched it yet, you should watch it because it's awesome. I don't necessarily mean, you don't have to be humorous like Guardians of the Galaxy. You don't have to have jokes and things in it, but this sort of cinematic with a vibe of real medieval fantasy mixed in, but it's sort of an action based, but with magic, throughout. Now, I know every world's going to be a little bit different, but we're talking about our baseline for design. And, the magic isn't even the important part. The important part here is that we're talking about semi-cinematic action, right? A game where you feel like you can run in and do something awesome and you feel cool and you feel like your character is cool and you might have hard, dramatic moments where everything goes against you. But at the end of the day, you walk away going like, that was a great experience. I'm going to remember that and tell my friends about it, right? And you plow through it with action and excitement and joy. And I think that's what we're going to be aiming for. But I'm going to send that out to all of you, and you guys are going to tell me what you think about that before we make our final design decision of it, right? Core mechanic, we got to work that out. We may have more than one. And it might sound crazy, but we're going to have to try a couple of things to make sure we're getting to the right place. Same with the dice mechanic. Again, this is something we're going to have to play with a little bit. Rewards. This is something that's really important because not only is the style of play, not as only is the core thing that the characters are doing important, but we need to know how we're rewarding people because the way we reward them determines the style of play. It's going to determine whether or not they want to continue to push forward and what things they try to do and accomplish along the way. All right. So we're going to come back to some more of that stuff. Including some more cool design stuff at the end. But now I'm going to jump into our weekly design challenge. Now, before I do that, I'm going to pause for just a minute. You guys might know that Owen Casey Stevens, who is awesome and who is one of our consulting designers, is dealing with some medical stuff, and he's an American, so you can know what that adds up to, right? So unfortunately, he's dealing with some stuff, and we are trying to help him out. There's actually a very cool thing going on. This is a long link, and I apologize for that. I'm going to try to copy that into the comments as well. But there's a bundle on DriveThru RPG with the funds going to help support his medical bills that he's dealing with right now. And I think it'd be awesome if you guys checked it out. If it's within your means, awesome. I know everybody's got stuff going on right now, but it's very cool. There might be some Taltis books in there. I'm just saying, if you checked it out, there's actually 2 of those, but it would be very, very cool for folks to check that out, because, what we said when we started this whole thing was that we are all about community, that gaming is a community. And this is another chance for us to show what that community is all about. So I just wanted to pass it along to you folks. Definitely check it out. And if nothing else, it's an amazing deal on a ton of cool stuff. Eclipse Phase is in there. I mean, the list is huge. I just got it, and I took like all night downloading all of the PDFs that came along with those. So it's very cool. There's 2 of them. All right, a couple of things. Now, before we go on, I am going to take a second. Let me go ahead to look at a few more of the comments. There were a few comments about needing to add all sorts of things to make the game work. Be really clear, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is simply learning from the way the content is put together so that you can use that as a way to effectively present information and content to your players. And I think that that's a very, very cool thing to think about. Right? Doesn't mean it's going to have a million cards and tokens and all sorts of stuff. Although admittedly, I personally enjoy that stuff, but not if I have to buy a whole lot of extra just to play. But it does mean that we can learn from how they present their content. And that's an important lesson for us, right? Absolutely. Let me look at this here. There's also a comment here from Scott Gardner. I've never seen one that has a personal goal line or desires line. Could help the player set or change goals for the character and reinforce the ways they play. I've seen some of that before, and it is very cool, some of those things. And we do have opportunities to build some of that in. 5th edition tried to do some of that with your 4 different, values and traits and things up at the top that they would add. I think there are cool ways that you can do that. And I would like to see us make sure to give folks opportunities to help them. Zero the Blade says, not fun to buy a game and only have 60% of it. Oh my gosh, that is absolutely true. Oh, it makes me crazy, right? All right. So back to our weekly design challenge from last week. Now, just to remind you, in case you don't remember, and the design challenge was this. And every week we're going to have one of these where you guys can dive in and just come up with the craziest ideas you can, share games that you think did it well. Maybe it'll turn out to be stuff that we use in Cool Name, or maybe it'll just be something that we all learn from, right? It's really more about having fun as a group who all have really cool ideas to come together and brainstorm those and have some fun with them. So last week, instead of a countdown damage system where you have start with 50 HP and go down, what about a count up system? In other words, you don't lose hit points, you gain damage. And unlike a countdown system where 0 is dead or X wounds equals dead, there's no limit to the amount of injury you can sustain. Instead, more damage means a greater chance of death every time you take a hit. So we got some very interesting responses on this. So let me share what everybody had to say. First off, a few people said, what's the difference, right? I don't see that down or up makes any difference at all. Like you go down to 0 and then maybe you can go into negative hit points. And I get yeah, you're right. Technically, there's not really a difference. Someone said it's THAC0 versus AC. It's the same thing. It's technically the same thing. I would say that from my perspective, though, this idea that 0 is sort of a deadline, like a bottom line, right? I meant literally when I said deadline, right? Pun intended. It's the bottom line. And maybe you have some negative points, but generally 0 is just like heart stops, right? That's the straight line on the machine in the hospital. I think what I was saying is that you could potentially have like infinite as long as someone keeps making the rolls, amount of damage applied to you. Boromir, for example, clearly took way more than his hit points while defending the hobbits. And along the way, he just kept somehow standing, right? So you have those impossible things. Another comment, less intuitive. It's a great point. A lot of people don't see it as intuitive. You run out of things. You run out of gas. You run out of battery. You run out of on your phone. You don't keep gaining mileage until you run out of until the car stops running, right? And so I guess it kind of is less intuitive when you think about it. Someone said that if you did something like that, you'd have to reflect that in the rest of the system. So you don't have things going up and down. And does this one go up or does this one go down? I thought that was a really cool comment in the discussion about this. It was very, very cool. Wounds are complicated. A lot of people said this. And I thought this was interesting because I've always found wound system be kind of cool, but I am not in the majority, apparently. Lots of people are just like, oh, God, you got to figure out, I got these 3 wounds and they affected me this way. And now I have all these modifiers, but only in this case. And one's to my legs. So that doesn't matter when I'm throwing something. I'm like, that's fair, right? It can be a pretty complicated system, which leads to the next one, the dreaded death spiral. A lot of folks were talking about this whole idea that when you have that count up system where you don't just end at a certain point, it just feels like you're just limping along and being less and less heroic until you die, which I can totally see. Not really, it was cool when Boromir did it. It might not be quite as cool at the game table where you just become more and more incapable of doing anything of value until you're finally just like, dude, I just gonna collapse and die. I can't keep going. It's pointless. So yeah, the dreaded death spiral was a great point. Now, what did come up was a lot of talk about fatigues versus wounds. This whole concept that you could have the 2 different types of injury. And this is present in a lot of games. Don't get me wrong. We're not really breaking completely new ground here, but it was interesting to see how much people got into that discussion. You might call it vitality. You might call it fatigue. You might call it hit points. But the point is that you had this set of injury that was debilitating, that eventually would take you down, unconscious, dead, something. But then you also had wounds, which in some way encumbered you more long-term. And I thought it was interesting to see how much people were into that, because I kind of like the idea that you have your hit points. It's always, this is me now, always sort of bothered me that you can get down to 0 hit points. Someone casts a spell, you're at 3 hit points and you're completely better. Right? You took a ridiculous amount of damage. You took so many sword blows. You got stabbed through the heart with a spear and a dragon breathed fire on you. And an hour later, you're up and like going, nah, I'm good, man. Whatever. Even if it's not magic, you're still up and good. Makes me a little crazy in my brain every time I try to figure out why that works. And so I love the idea of sort of lingering wounds that, yeah, you can just get back up and keep fighting after a very short period of time. But there are costs, right? These things go on. So fatigue versus wounds got a lot of discussion along the way as we were going through this. Or injury versus wounds, again, same sort of discussion. This, as always, this has already spurred a lot of discussion in the comments. I'm going to take just a second to look at a few of these because there's some good stuff here. Let's see. Add damage so you cross maximum health. Yeah, again, one of the ideas here was just adding damage so you hit like a target point. Yeah, absolutely, you could do it that way. And one of the things I did think about was, that one comment about it needs to reflect the rest of the system. I thought that was cool because if you created an add up system where everything in the system adds up, target numbers add up, your ability to hit adds up, your damage adds up, your fatigue adds up. You create sort of this idea in the game that is pretty straightforward. Also, for whatever reason, adding is easier than subtracting for most people. So if I say, you add 13 to that, people have an easier time of adding 13 than subtracting 13 from something else. I don't know why. I haven't read enough articles about why the brain works that way, but I thought that was a really interesting thing. Okay, so moving on from this design challenge If I can get us to move on. There we go. Brings us to this week's design challenge. All right, folks, here's what you got. Normally, advancement is about character improvement. What if your character core traits, attributes, powers, skills, etc., never changed? How would you reward players for their accomplishments in a way that still benefited the characters and made the game feel like it was progressing and growing? How would you do that? Right? This is the challenge. I realize that it's not easy. And I realize there's some obvious ones, but the key thing here is, how do you keep the game feel like it's progressing and growing, that the characters are growing within the world without actually changing the characters? And I want you to think about Lord of the Rings as a great example. No one really walked away from Lord of the Rings significantly better or different than they started, except for probably Gandalf, right? You could argue even the hobbits really kind of, there are some exceptions. Merry and Pippin, maybe, right? They kind of came around, but like Frodo, is any better? Bilbo? I mean, he had cool stuff. His hobbit hole was awesome after, right? Filled with gold, and he could, didn't have to work. But that's what I'm going to ask you guys to challenge yourselves, is thinking about creative ways that you could have players rewarded for the accomplishments of their characters without having direct advancement of their character. So there you go. That's this week's challenge. I will post it on Discord. I will post it on Facebook. You can answer there and tell us what you think. All right. Now I'm going to jump in. How are we doing? Holy crap. I'm almost out of time, folks. I'm going to have to wrap this up quickly. I'm sorry. Every week I'm like, I'm going to keep it to half an hour because everybody's busy. But I got to tell you, there's just too many cool things to talk about. Design thoughts on skills. So I pulled up some research papers on skill, because that's how I do game design, because I'm that kind of a nerd. And I started reading those documents. One of them was from a researcher. His name was, and I'm going to do my very best to pronounce it properly, Shun-Ching Zhan. Shun-Ching Zhan wrote a paper about skills. And what is skill? How is it defined? What is it? A skill is typically defined, and this is a quote straight from their paper, a skill is typically defined as the learned ability to bring about predetermined results with maximum certainty, often with the minimum outlay of time or energy, or both. I thought this was interesting, and I read additional articles, and they all kept coming back to this, that the definition of skill is the ability to accomplish a determined result with certainty. There's always a chance, of course, in certain situations, but the reality is mostly about certainty. In most games, it's about giving you a better chance. But by definition, in these research papers about the human condition and what skills are, it's about certainty. It's also about reducing time and reducing energy. Those are two things that seldom come into play when you're creating a skill system in a role-playing game. Now, not never, but seldom. And so I think that's something that we can learn from, is looking at these definitions of what skills are and thinking about, are we using them right in the way they typically get used in a game? So I'm going to leave you guys with that design thought on skills. Should be interesting for you to think about over the course of the week. So it's absolutely fascinating. Also, design philosophy idea. So I started thinking about this, and what is it that we're doing in the game? We are, and this is sort of an outline that I put together in terms of how I'm thinking. I'm sharing these things because I go through about 1,000 of these things a day as I'm working through this stuff. And I'm sharing some of the thought process that goes into it, because I have a pretty mechanical way of thinking. It's stripping away all of the trappings of what it looks like and getting down to the core of what it is we're building, because then you can just put all that stuff back on and it looks gorgeous, but it elegantly functions underneath. So in a game, I identify a target. It's the thing that I want to make a change to. Next, I decide how I want it to change. So perhaps I see my friend Matt standing beside me, and I want Matt to be over 5 feet from me. So the next thing is the lever. What thing am I going to use in order to create the effect that I desire? How is this going to work? And so that's the next piece of it is what is the lever that I'm going to use? Now, in this case, it might be my strength, my physical bulk. I'm going to throw it against Matt. He's my target. And to get the effect of having him move, which brings us to the last bit, which is skill, the precision with which I wield my lever to reduce the randomness. I want to definitely move him. And so I think this is an interesting way for us to start breaking it down because we start thinking about how do you define a lever in a game? Perhaps you define it as a ability roll. Perhaps you define it as a tool. Perhaps you either all these different ways you can define this and you start thinking about how that it works. And then you start thinking about what the effect is and what the difficulty of wielding that lever as you go along. Which brings us to another piece that often gets left out, which is what is the cost for me to create the desired effect? In reality, things have a cost. And in some games, things have some very interesting costs. That's not always true in games, though. Often we stop at the skill part and we don't get to the cost part. And so I think that's another interesting thing for us to think about. It came up a lot in that discussion about skills and about looking at wounds. It came up a lot on Discord and talking about whether maybe you have scores in different areas, like a mental exhaustion that eventually comes to you. And so this is one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of how you use abilities in the game and the potential for having something, and let's talk about design, information design, a series of boxes where once those boxes are filled, you need to rest or drink a potion or get aid from a friend. You need something to help you regain whatever it is you spent to create the effect that you're looking for. And I think that there are some ways that we could make this exceptionally simple and yet rich and very fun to play. Now, probably advanced rules, because in basic rules, you just want to play. You don't want to mess with that. But in advanced rules, it might be really fun to say, my character just needs to fall back, or I need somebody to fight beside me for a few rounds so that I can get my morale back up, or I can not defend myself quite so vigorously. Very cool stuff for us to think about as we're working through that. All right. This brings us to the last piece that probably a lot of folks are waiting to see more about, which is talking about first steps. I want to share with you some core design pieces that we're putting together now. And there's going to be a survey about this, and that's going to be the last thing we're going to talk about tonight. These first steps are looking at attributes. There's been a lot of discussion of attributes. Should we have attributes? Should we have packages of skills? At this stage of the game, I'm going to argue that attributes make sense. And the reason is this. First, they represent a very basic, bottom level way to interact with the game. If we go back to my little thought experiment there, this is the lever. These are the 4 most basic levers that you can have in the game. You can use your body, you can use your mind, you can use your personality, your presence, or you can use your spirit, because in games there's, spirit is a real thing that we actually see. You actually kind of, I'm not going to get into the argument of how much you see it in the real world today. The reality is that those are the 4 core elements on the levers you use in your world. Second, by having these attributes and having scores of some kind attached to them. Now, we'll talk about that another time, but having scores attached to them, it allows you to very quickly compare things within the world, because the reality is that we're not there. We're not in the world. And we need a way from our perspective outside of the world to compare things. And that's super valuable. The last thing is that having a base set of attributes fits with core expectations for most role-playing games. And although having just skills and having them sort of bundled in a way makes a lot of sense and is very cool, this is closer to what people are expecting. And so I believe that these 3 arguments make it that we should have some form of attributes. Now, what happens with these attributes? We've also talked on a lot of the forums. There's been discussions of what you might call like exploding attributes, attribute trees, for example. Yes, there's body, but at a more advanced game, you could then start to break body out into saying, well, but I'm stronger than I am agile. I'm tougher than I am strong. It allows you to start to break these out in a different way. But at the most basic level, you don't have to mess with that. You can just have people go out there and play fun, exciting games where they have an easy lever that they can use to interact with the world. So we're going to play test it. I'm going to get feedback from all of you, but this is where we're leaning at the moment. And this is what's on our base design that we're going to be putting out in the very near future. The next thing I want to talk about is skills. We've been talking about skill levels. There's an argument that's been made in some of the discussions we've been having internally that more than 5 levels of skill is excessive and unnecessary. That really, at the end of the day, a game is based on a relatively small range in terms of how we think about it of skill. Smaller gradients along the way are not as valuable. The second thing that came was that human beings are generally not great at pure numerical assessment. And by having a set of skills, you also create the foundation for a set of difficulties where a GM can look at something and they don't have to say, is that a +2? They can say, what type of skilled person, and going back to our skill theory, what type of skilled person could just do this reliably? They don't have to even worry about it. This is right up their alley. They could do it. Here's a cliff face. Look, any untrained person can give this a shot. It's got tons of handholds. Here's a steeper cliff face, and it's got fewer handholds, and it looks a little tough. An apprentice, they could do that. And so on and so forth. Maybe you add fog to it. Well, with fog, no longer an apprentice difficulty. That's an adept difficulty. So this is a way that we could try to explore, and we're going to have to test this, a simple way for GMs and players to quickly assess the difficulty of a situation at hand and how that compares to their own abilities. And that's what our goal is, so they can quickly and easily do that. So again, we're all going to work together to make this happen in a way that works for everyone. So if you're seeing this and going, oh my God, no, what's wrong with you people? Don't panic. We're all going to talk about it. We're going to test it, but this is where we're leaning at the moment. All right, last thing. Survey number 2. This is finally coming out now that I have all the information from our consulting designers. We're going to be asking you about style of play. We're going to be asking you about dice mechanics. We're going to be asking you about your length of games. In other words, how long do your campaigns last? In your experience, do they really last a long time? Do most don't? Advancement, the attributes, the things we're talking about, the concept of exploding attributes, and the skill levels that we talked about. You're going to be getting that information soon. You're going to get to take a look at it, and then we are going to talk about it some more next week. So I have 3 minutes left. I'm coming in just under the wire. Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight. It was great to talk with all of you again, and I am very excited to see this stuff finally starting to solidify. We're like this close to rolling some dice. So thanks to everyone. Again, make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, tell your friends about it, and also check out the very cool bundles on DriveThruRPG. Let's help out a friend if you are able. And that's it for tonight. Thank you, everyone. I'll talk to you later.